Buongiorno.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming so numerous. We are very glad to have this afternoon Professor Perry MEHRLING, who is a professor at of economics at the Badgett College, and who is the director of the training programs at the Institute for New Economic Thinking.
Many events. Scusa, ho cambiato lingua. Sì, è l'INET che ha organizzato alcuni eventi.
INET has organized many important events in these days. Allow me to make a short comment on the agenda or the program of Young Scholars Initiatives, which has been active for more than 1 year now, with meetings in Berlin and Hong Kong, and which is indeed extremely interesting for young economists who can become part of a network and support new approaches. And I'm sure that our guest indeed will have the opportunity to go back to that. Professor MEHRLING, very happy to have him here. We indeed can provide a very nice bird's eye view on what has happened after the financial crisis, and also more than 100 years of financial and economic history. Professor MEHRLING has concentrated on the history of money and the history of finance. This approach, or these approaches, have been described in his books. In one of his books, entitled "The Money Interest and the Public Interest," which has not been translated in Italian or French. Anyway, there are publishers who might think of publishing that book in these two languages. He also published a book entitled Fischer-Black and the Revolution Ideas of Finance, based on the life and work of Fischer-Black, where he describes modern financial activities. His latest book, published by Princeton University 2 years ago, The New Lumber Street, How the Fed Became the Dealer of Last Resort. Still, this book is not available in Italian, but you can buy that in Chinese if you want to read it. But I hope that the book will soon be translated into French, Italian, Spanish, and so on, because this is a really burning issue in the light of the present financial crisis. So this book speaks about two focuses, the history of money and the history of the world of finance. There is a question today about the coordination of central banks. Is that coordination possible? Which are the challenges of financial globalization and the future of central banks? This is a subject which has been discussed for many years. We had an experience of coordination of banks of 20 years ago. In the past years, we have been discussing about the nature of this coordination. There is a very interesting case study, is that of shadow banking, which is very interesting. These are the present challenges, and these are the challenges for the future. We have an experience of more than 1 century the way in which central banks tackled such issues. After the presentation, indeed, we'll have the opportunity to entertain questions. So, Professor MEHRLING, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you all see the slides behind me? Yes? So I move to the first one, and I'm going to try to speak slowly for the translation, which is not so easy for me because I come from New York City. And you may have heard the expression, a New York minute. So I have to pretend I'm Italian for today and have a slower pace of life and a slower pace of speech. Here is my first provocative slide. Forget the G7, watch the C5. This is the G7, of course, is the finance ministers of the most important 7 large economies of the world. But you probably haven't heard of the C5, so I will tell you who they are. They are the 5 central banks that are the most important central banks of the world, which are the Bank of England, the ECB, the Fed, the Swiss National Bank, and the Bank of Japan. When I say about coordination of central banking, I mean about coordination of these 5 central banks, the 5 most important central banks, all of which, at this moment, in one way or another, specific to their local conditions, are engaged in monetary innovation, so-called quantitative easing, coordinated. I don't know how officially, but they're all doing it. The United States was sort of first, and others followed along, and the Bank of Japan is the final one to come into line with this policy. I want to talk today about what is quantitative easing, why they're doing it, what its likely effects are going to be. But I also want to talk about the longer run. I want to talk about the future of central banking. This quantitative easing thing is about dealing with the emergency. Okay, and the question is, what are and the central banks, all 5 of them, are trying to buy time. That's essentially what this policy is doing, buying time for us to build the banking system of the future, to rebuild from the crisis. That means involving the finance ministers. That means involving the political authorities. That means involving everyone. Okay, and it's very important. This is the most important message that I want you to take away today. That we use the time that the central bankers are buying us, okay, to make important decisions for the future. Because I think if we use this time well, the future could be quite bright. And if we use this time poorly, we will not have a chance. And the things that they are trying to ward off with this policy will hit us. So it's a very important moment we are living in, a moment of opportunity, but also of danger. and it's an exciting time to be studying monetary economics. I'm referring, some of you will have gone to Andy Haldane's lecture this morning, and I see this very much as following from that lecture. So if you didn't go, you should get it on tape and see it, and see them. And I think this is the right order to see them, because his talk was mostly about issues of solvency. And my talk is going to be almost entirely about issues of liquidity. And so these are, they're orthogonal, but they're connected, and you'll see. So I hope I'm not speaking too fast. I hope I'm not speaking too slow. What is quantitative easing? This slide here is the balance sheet of the Fed, the Central Bank of the United States, during the financial crisis. And now I'm going to switch to an alternative technology here so that I can point some of the things out. Yes. Hello? On the top here, this is the assets of the Federal Reserve Bank. And on the bottom, it's liabilities, which are plotted as negative numbers. And it's a bank, which means that assets and liabilities are the same size in total. This is time along this axis, and it comes from January 07 to March of 2010. Okay. The vertical lines are Bear Stearns, the collapse of Bear Stearns, and the collapse of Lehman and AIG in March of 2008 and in September of 2008. So you may not remember this particular time, but I was teaching money and banking during all of this. And every day something new happened. It was a very exciting time to be alive. And that's what led me to write this book that you're referring to, The New Lombard Street. The crisis, however, began in the fall of, or in the summer really, August, I would say, of 2007, but you can't see it in this balance sheet. That's because the Fed's first reaction to the balance sheet was just to lower the interest rate, lower the Fed funds rate from 5% to 2%. There was very little balance sheet effect. You can see here, before the crisis, the Fed was a very simple operation. On the asset side were treasury bills, and on the liability side was currency. Yes, there were some bank reserves on the liability side. There were some other things on the asset side. But mostly, it's treasury bills and currency. Pretty simple things. These dark blue, that's treasury bills, that's currency. And it transformed utterly in this crisis, as you can see. After Bear Stearns, you could see that this policy of lowering interest rates in order to try to deal with a crisis was not enough. And the Fed did more. And what it did, you can see there, it sold off half of its treasury bills and lent the proceeds to broker-dealers, to whoever seemed to need it. They were trying to help the system more broadly, not just confining themselves to the discount window, but the term asset facility started here, and so forth. And that worked for a while, but ultimately it wasn't enough. And Lehman and AIG failed. And then the Fed moved into really hyperdrive. And you can see that they had sold off half their treasury bills. They sold off a few more, but mostly they expanded their balance sheet on both sides. Okay? They borrowed from the Treasury. That's what that is. Okay, and they issued more reserves. And they used the proceeds of that to lend to the same people they were lending to here before, but also $600 billion, okay, lending to foreign central banks. This is the liquidity swap lines. And then ultimately this Aqua thing here, buying $1 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities. If you got a mortgage or refinanced a mortgage during this period, it was the Fed that was lending you the money. This is extraordinary. This is innovation in monetary action, and this is what we need to understand. Why did the Fed do this? Did it work? Is it going to have to do it again? Where are we? What does this all mean? This is what I want to talk about today. The Fed tripled in size during this period, and its balance sheet, its composition of its balance sheet changed. The composition of its liabilities changed. This is quantitative easing. Now I'm going to return down here. this method. I would say we are living in, I'm saying we're living in a Badgett moment. That's my view. And what do I mean by that? Walter Badgett wrote a very famous book in 1873 called Lombard Street, A Description of the Money Market. That's the book there on the left. And he was talking about the London money market. He was talking about the financial crises that happened in the London money market, which was then the center of the world financial system in 1873. And he was looking back in history, and he was saying, noticing and pointing out to all of his readers, this was a bestseller actually in 1873, pointing out to all of his readers that in a financial crisis, the Bank of England always did the same thing, okay? They always lent freely at a high interest rate against good security. This became known as the Badgett Rule. The central bankers always claimed that they didn't do this at all, okay? They denied that they did this, but he said, yes, you are doing this. Not only are you doing this, but it's the right thing to do. And here's why, and you should bring this rule up to consciousness and do it now on purpose. And eventually central bankers said, you know what, that's right. And this was the beginning of modern monetary economics in some sense. Modern central banking theory, where central bankers said, yes, that is our responsibility to put a floor under the markets at a time of crisis, and this is what we're going to do. So everyone now agrees that the Badgett Rule is orthodoxy. Okay, it was heterodoxy in 1873, but it's now orthodoxy. And this is the origin of modern monetary policy also. Once the central bank takes responsibility for putting a floor under the crisis, they inevitably take responsibility for trying to prevent the crisis from happening in the first place. And that means stabilization policy, that means microprudential policy, that means macroprudential policy. It means whatever it is that could keep this problem in the markets from dropping onto the balance sheet of the central bank. No central banker wants to do this. They do this as a last resort. They're the lender of last resort. And today, so this third book that I wrote, The New Lombard Street, is specifically referencing that for an audience that has heard of Badgett and has heard of Lombard Street. My publishers were a little anxious that people wouldn't know what Lombard Street referred to, and I told them not to worry. They should, and if they don't, they will learn, okay? That it's important that they realize that we are living in a Badgett moment when we are having to reconsider, as Badgett did in 1873, what should a central bank be doing? What is the right policy for a central bank? Where does it fit in the political economy? What is the role of central banking? And why are we facing this problem? We're facing this problem, of course, because of the crisis, and I just showed you that central banks, the Central Bank of the United States, did things that it swore up and down, would have sworn up and down it will never do, okay, and yet it did them, okay? And it has been swearing up and down that it will never do them again, okay, but only if there's not another crisis of this kind. So we know the emergency is here, but I want here to tell you that the reason the Fed had to invent all these new things is because the financial system has been transformed. We're living in a new financial world, in this world of financial globalization, which is not new in history. As a matter of fact, our world today is not so different from the world of the late 19th century, okay, when England was the head and we had global financialization. They didn't have fancy derivatives. They didn't have, electronic exchanges. They didn't have, but the economics was very similar. And some of the challenges they were facing were very similar. London was the center of the world then. New York is the center of the world now. Okay. I often tell my students, it's better to read books that are 100 years old than books that are 50 years old because they're more modern. They're more up to date for the world that we're living in today. The world of 1950, okay, is completely an anomaly when the global financial markets were just in a shambles and it was all about government markets, and there was all of these government securities from World War II inherited. This is anomalous, and in some sense the world we're living in here is more normal for the long history of capitalism, but it's not normal to us, okay, and so we have to learn about it. here's another provocative claim. I'm claiming on this slide, shadow banking is the characteristic institutional form of the modern financial globalized world. It's the characteristic institutional form, something we need to understand because it's not going away, okay? It's with us. It's not some mushroom growth created by the wizards of Wall Street in order to bamboozle us, okay? It is the characteristic institutional form of the modern financially globalized world. And it's this sort of form that we need to come to understand and understand what is the role of the central bank and what is the role of regulation and all of this for this new form, okay? Not bank loans, but shadow banking, or to use a less freighted, less ideological term, market-based credit. Some people say non-bank. That just seems to exclude everything but banks. I want to have a positive term, market-based credit. When I say shadow banking, what I mean is those words in quotations there. Money market funding of capital market lending. Okay? Money market funding of capital market lending. That means typically global funding of local lending, because funding markets are global, whereas lending is always local. It's some entity in some particular geographic region borrowing. A household in the mortgage market or a business. It's also, importantly, typically means dollar funding, because the world money markets are ultimately dollar money markets, the dollar being the world reserve currency. So for Europe, there's going to be a foreign exchange sort of element here. If this is true, what I'm telling you, that this is the characteristic institutional form of the modern system. The second bullet point there, the thing, and I think maybe the most important thing to understand why market-based credit is different from your intuitions about bank loans, is market pricing on both sides of the balance sheet. Market pricing of the funding, money market funding, and market pricing of the lending of the securities, okay, that are created in this system. Both money and capital, there are prices. There are prices that make this system go, that are determined in competitive dealer markets. And that's the third bullet point. The key role of market-making institutions in determining these prices. Quoting buy-sell spreads in the funding markets. Quoting buy-sell spreads in capital markets. And it's these prices that make the system go. From this point of view, the key role of the central bank is backstopping not so much the shadow banks themselves, which are doing money market funding of capital market lending. We're used to that. It's backstopping the price-making mechanism, backstopping the dealer-making mechanism. This is what I mean to signal by the subtitle of my book, How the Fed Became the Dealer of Last Resort. So I think of us, and I tell my students this back home, as being at the very beginning of a process of intellectual inquiry and of institutional groping and invention for the world of the future. And I thought to myself 2 or 3 years ago, as we were in the middle of the crisis, how can I help? I'm a professor, you know. And there's this huge regulatory discussion going on and people with lots of knowledge about the details of the markets. How can I help? And I thought I can help by trying to look a bit further beyond the immediate crisis and think about the world of the future, a vision of the future, and imagine, well, what would be necessary to make that world work? And I imagined, and I'm going to imagine with you today, and I invite you to come along on this journey, a world in which there is only shadow banking. There's only market-based credit. There's no traditional banking at all, okay? It's all shadow banking. How would we work a world like that? What would be the source of instability in a world like that? And how would we put bounds on it? How would we run monetary policy in a world like that? How would we do everything in a world like that? So you see, I'm doing the opposite abstraction of most people, okay, who are imagining that shadow banking was some sort of little seed of evil that got dropped into the world, okay? And I'm saying, let's just go the other way. If we think of this as the characteristic institutional form of financial globalization, and if we think that financial globalization is here to stay, then shadow banking is here to stay. And we better grab a hold of it. Not to say that there wasn't a lot of illegal stuff that happened that caused this crisis, or a lot of nefarious things, but some of this is bad people. Some of this is groping toward a new system that we didn't really know what we were building. And so I'm going to begin by imagining that we've finished this groping and we now have this idealized shadow banking system that I'm going to describe in this slide here. So here's an imagination of a world that's only market-based credit. Perhaps I'll move to the other technology again so that I can make some points. And so this entity here that I'm calling a capital funding bank, that's in order to avoid the word shadow bank. But you can see, remember my definition of shadow bank. It was money market funding of capital market lending, and that's what's going on there. Money market funding of capital market lending. RMBS stands for residential mortgage-backed security. So this is my example. It could be any securitized thing, but it's the US example. And so just imagine residential mortgage-backed security. So this is the shadow bank. The funding for this bank is coming from what I call a global money dealer. This might be one of the global banks that is collecting deposits from all over the world and then on lending them here. So there's deposits on one side. This is the wholesale money market, so that's why I put deposits in quotes. Okay, they may be shorter term than the money market funding, which might be 90 days or 6 months or something like that. This is the global money dealer that's doing the funding. This dealer is quoting a buy-sell spread. This is where the price of funding gets determined. Okay, remember I emphasized that there's market pricing on both sides of the balance sheet. Where does the price of the residential mortgage-backed security come from? It is sort of the sum of the price of funding and all the various risks that are in that that are embodied in that. And what I'm showing here is an idealization that this capital funding bank is stripping out all the risk using derivatives. Okay, this is an imagination. There's no such thing as a perfect hedge, but I'm imagining that there's a perfect hedge here. And instead of using all the complicated mechanisms of the actual shadow banking system, you've heard of them, the slicing, the dicing, the tranching, the CDO squareds and all of that. A much more straightforward risk transfer system where you just have credit default swaps for the default risk, interest rate swaps to move these 30-year mortgages down into variable rate, and foreign exchange swaps if we're dealing with a security that is issued in something other than dollars. Those hedges, if you combine with the risky asset, give you a riskless asset, riskless portfolio here on the asset side, which is used as collateral possibly for borrowing in the wholesale money market. Here's the other important entity. I said the money market, the global money dealer was important for determining the funding price, and I'm imagining a derivative dealer, okay, that is making markets in these various derivatives: credit default swaps, interest rate swaps, foreign exchange swaps. This is where the price of risk is determined, okay, from this dealer making two-sided markets in risk. To complete the model, I have on the right-hand side there what I call an asset manager. You could imagine this to be an institutional investor like a pension fund, as Andy was mentioning this morning. So it could be a pension fund. This pension fund, instead of holding residential mortgage-backed securities outright, okay, is getting the risk exposure to residential mortgage-backed securities by through this derivative exposure, through holding credit default swaps, interest rate swaps, foreign exchange swaps. It's on the other side. The risk is being transferred from the shadow bank to the pension fund. It may confuse you that I put this on one side of the balance sheet or the other. So I'm just understand the words. There are no conventions at the moment for how to book this stuff on balance sheets. So I have developed some conventions for my students, and I'm not sure they will stick. Okay, but I think the ideas will stick. So I'm showing this asset manager as investing, as having capital and investing in the money market, which is actually funding all of this, okay, and then getting exposure to risk markets through the derivative dealer here. So again, the important entities from this point of view in this model are these dealers who are determining the prices. They're determining the prices. I'll say one more thing about this and then move to the next slide. Notice where the risk is in this world. If the hedges are perfect, and if these dealers have exactly the same risk on their liability side as on their asset side, so they're short and long the same risk, so they have matched book, the only risk in this system is, the only net risk in this system is right here. All of the risk is on the balance sheet of the asset manager. And where is the capital in this system? It's all on the balance sheet of the asset manager. So this is a very strong idealization, right? An idealization of a world where we've stripped out all the risk here, all the risk here, all the risk here. There's no risk anywhere except here. And so that's where you want the capital to be, and that's where the capital is. I put forward this model not because it's a realistic model of the world, but because I think it may help us think about some of these issues of capital adequacy and so forth that people are thinking about and trying to be concerned about. What is it that we need capital for when we're talking about dealers, when we're talking about shadow banks? And what is it that we need liquidity for, and so forth? If the world were really like this, you wouldn't need any capital anywhere except with the asset manager. This is not the real world. Even in my imagination, I can't imagine that this is the real world. And why not? Because certainly these dealers are not going to be able to do their job of making markets if they have to have matched book all the time. What does a dealer do? A dealer makes markets by, whenever somebody's demanding and no one's supplying, they absorb that demand. And that makes them have mismatched book. So there's no way you can actually create liquidity in these markets if you insist on having only matched books. So there's going to be mismatched books. So let's move there. So this is that same diagram, but now what I've done is I put some reserves, liquidity reserves, on the balance sheet of the money dealers and the derivative dealers, and I put some capital there so that if they're facing solvency risk, they need capital. They're facing liquidity risk, they need reserves. And I call this backstopping market making first resort, because we definitely want, these dealers are profit-seeking entities. Okay? We want them to be absorbing the risk themselves. We don't want to be backstopping them as a first resort by the central bank. We want them to be backstopping themselves. Okay? I'm not putting anything on the balance sheet of the shadow bank. Maybe we want something there, but I'm trying to point out that the regulatory discussion has so far very much focused on the shadow banks, not on the dealers. And from this point of view, the dealers are much more important. And so I'm focusing only on them in order to make that point. As a first resort, solvency risk is handled with capital, liquidity risk with reserves. The role of the central bank in a world like this would be as last resort, and not as a solvency last resort. Maybe the Treasury wants to do that, or the taxpayer wants to do that, but as a liquidity last resort. And I'm putting that on the balance sheet here of the global money dealer and the derivative dealer as a contingent asset, that there are reserves that they can get access to through the central bank, and as a contingent liability of the central bank. And notice I'm saying, or C5, okay, the combination of central banks working in consort to backstop the world financial markets. It's an abstract idea. How does it line up with what the experience was in the crisis? I'm showing here in the left-hand side the balance sheet of the Central Bank of the United States, the Fed, as of December 15th, 2011. You can see that it had, so this is after the crisis, it had $1.7 trillion worth of Treasury bills. At that time, it was mostly bills. They hadn't moved into QE3. 0.9 trillion of mortgage-backed securities and other risky kinds of securities. And on the liability side, $1 trillion worth of currency and $1.6 trillion worth of excess reserves. Okay. Now I'm going to do, in the right-hand side, I am just adding numbers to both sides of that balance sheet so that I'm not changing the balance at all. I'm adding the same number to both sides, so I'm not changing the risk exposure at all either. And I think now I'll switch to the other technology again. We're testing out the availability here at Trento. So on the other, so I'm adding here risky securities 0.9. Those are the same as that. Adding treasury bonds, risk-free government bonds to both sides, 0.9 trillion. To give me, and then I'm adding 2.6 trillion of treasury bills to both sides. And so that the total is now 6.4 trillion. Okay. So I haven't changed the risk exposure at all because I've added the same thing to both sides. Okay. All I've done, so these are sort of notional amounts. And why am I emphasizing notional amounts? Because in the swap market, the notional amounts are in the background and you're paying based on these notional amounts. So you could imagine the Fed doing all of its activities not by buying and selling treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, but by buying and selling credit default swaps and interest rate swaps and things like that. And in fact, I've written it so that this line here is basically a credit default swap, a long position in risky securities and a short position in treasury bonds. This line here is basically an interest rate swap, a long position in treasury bonds and a short position in treasury bills. And this top line is like the overnight interest rate swap, a sort of money market term, T-bills on this side, and currency reserves, which are paying interest on excess reserves on the right-hand side. This is what the balance sheet would look like if, in fact, they had been engaging in actual swaps. And I point that out just because you see there, this is the balance sheet that I was suggesting, a Fed that was acting as backstop of last resort, okay, of my idealized shadow banking system, would be having a liquidity put on the liability side that would come into the money during a crisis. And that's what I'm showing you. That's exactly what happened with the Fed. It had a liquidity put. It came in. They didn't intend to do this. They weren't thinking about this. They were responding to a crisis, okay? And but this was their response. This was their response. Their response was to behave in the way that I'm suggesting an idealized central bank might work in my idealized shadow banking system. Okay? And that's why it worked, I think. That's why it worked. In 1873, Badgett proposed a rule, the Badgett Rule: lend freely at a high rate against good security. What I see emerging in this crisis is a new rule, a rule for the market-based credit system, okay, where the central bank backstops not banks, okay, but asset markets, but capital markets, okay. It doesn't, it's the equivalent to the high rate for Badgett is an outside spread, which is to say the Fed is willing to support these markets at a price considerably away from fundamental value, say 20 or 30% away from fundamental value, as a last resort. So they're not trying to make these fair priced. They're trying to put a floor on these prices, and not on all prices, but only core markets, not periphery. That's what I think is maybe the equivalent to lending against good security, choosing a set of core markets. In the United States, it was, of course, mortgage markets. The U.S. the Fed bought $1 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities. In Europe, the ECB is buying peripheral sovereign debt, but it's a similar operation. So we can learn that the Fed. So the lesson I'm taking from this is that during the crisis, the Fed innovated. Did they always do the right thing? I'm not going to argue that at all. But I am arguing that in the process of this chaotic moment, they invented some stuff that worked. Why did it work? It worked because it put a floor, it recreated the markets that were frozen up. The money markets and the capital markets. That's what it was doing. At the moment, those markets aren't working all that well, partly because the Fed is focusing on exiting, okay, instead of focusing on making those markets work better. So in conclusion, I have 4 points about unfinished business, okay, that maybe we can talk about in the Q&A period. From this point of view, quantitative easing should be understood as putting a floor under the financial market. It's not stimulus. Not as stimulus. It's not monetary. I mean, I know central bankers talk about this, okay? But from this point of view, it's not so much stimulus, it's putting a floor. Stimulus would involve getting the prices wrong, okay? Pushing funding prices way low, or pushing asset prices below their fundamental value. Maybe they're doing that, and maybe that's not such a good idea. Okay, but the quantitative easing part, that is to say, the expansion of the balance sheet on both sides, that's ultimately about supporting these markets, and as I said at the very beginning, supporting them until they can support themselves. Okay, buying time for these markets to recover. That's the first point. Floor, not a stimulus. Second point, central bank coordination. None of this would really be possible if speculators could flee from your currency into other major currencies. I think this is one of the reasons why we have coordination, why QE is happening in all 5 of the central banks at the same time, to prevent instability at that level of the international monetary system. It's not preventing instability farther down, because it's only coordination of these 5 central banks, not other central banks in the world. That's the second point. Now, that's still about the crisis, but I really want to keep us focused here on the longer run, because I think at times of crisis it's very helpful to have in mind where you're trying to go, so that you don't focus too much on the short-term buffeting. I think we are in early days of developing a structural reform that will make the international financial globalization work. That should be our goal. Either global financialization works, or we are kind of doomed, in my view. And we haven't really begun to sort of think about it in that way. It's still quite national, the focus on reform, and coordination of this reform globally is, I think, also crucial. So getting the structures right is the first step. When we do that, I think we will begin a process of intellectual exploration about how to make this new system work better. I said at the very beginning, Badgett, 1873, was the beginning of a century-long exploration of what we can use the central bank for. Once we put a floor, we decided, oh, well, maybe we can stabilize. Maybe we should manipulate the discount rate, okay, in order to prevent crises or ward them off or so forth. We're going to have to invent new monetary theory for this new financial system that is emerging. And we're at a very primitive stage here. A primitive stage is a good stage, okay, from the point of view of students, right? Because that means there's lots of work to be done, lots of dissertations to be written, lots of careers to be built. We're at the very ground floor of a brave new world, okay, that I'm hopeful we'll be able to build, that we will hold it together long enough in order to create time to build this new world. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor. We welcome now questions from the audience, not only from PhD candidates, but from everybody interested to have some answers, more precise answers, maybe on one point or the other, to add a topic to the discussion. I have the microphone here.
Oh yes, we need to pass that around to them. Yes.
Forse solo una
Please introduce yourselves when you ask questions.
Thank you for your lecture. My name is Roberto Tamborini, University of Trento. I have two questions. The first is, why should market-based credit, suppose that is a good or inevitable thing that's here to stay with us, should be shadowy? Shadow banking means that is invisible to regulators. Why don't we have market-based credit out of the shade? I hope that we'll have it, if it is a good thing. The second question is more a curiosity. If you can go back to the slide with these balance sheets of the three different imaginative, okay, that's one. At first sight, if we take the consolidated balance sheet on the left, we end up with a traditional bank, RMBS vis-a-vis capital. That's more or less a traditional bank. So my provocative question is, what we see here, I think that it's a good approximation of what's going on in the world. Can we interpret it as a complexification in order to create new needs, new services, new sources of profits? That's a marketing strategy. You create new, perhaps useless things, then they become inevitable, and then you create new opportunities of business, new opportunities of profits. That's marketing. So it's a bit provocative, but I would like to see your reaction. Thank you.
I think both of these go right to the core. So I appreciate them, and I'm sympathetic to the spirit where they come from. So let me just be clear about that. Yes, I think I'm glad for the opportunity to confirm that my goal is exactly to bring the shadow banking system out of the shadows. Okay, that it's partly been in the shadows, I must say, because regulators didn't know what to do with it. You know, they felt that they understood something, and they certainly, coming from the United States, you know, the regulators just said, oh well, that's all happening in Europe somewhere, and some insurance companies over there are going to get into trouble someday. Okay, not my problem. Okay, yes, your problem, I want to say. You know, everyone's problem. That we need to bring this inside our discussion of regulation, and I will even go farther than that. My intention with this this particular diagram here is to provide a roadmap for regulators to understand the different functions, the different parts of the system, which maybe you want to treat in different ways, okay? And which are maybe, at the moment, many of these are all jumbled together, okay, inside single institutions. You know, any large investment bank is basically in all four of these businesses. And I think my intention is to conceptually distinguish different functions so that you might want to then develop a reporting system about each of these four systems so that you pay attention to them a little bit differently and you capitalize them differently, you reserve them differently, and so forth. Maybe they should be in different institutions, or if they are in the same institutions, maybe you want firewalls between them. I'm not sure. I'm trying to distinguish the functions so that we can see them. Now, your second question about complexification, I'm sympathetic to as well. This diagram, I should be clear, is my attempt to simplify. To simplify the famous map of Zoltan Pozsar, okay, of the shadow banking system, which had 7 different columns, and he was talking about the origination, and then the warehousing, and then the this, and the tranching, and it's very complicated. And I said to myself, okay, I'm an economist. What is actually going on here? What are the underlying economic functions? And let me strip this down as simple as possible. it's completely correct what you say, okay, that if you were to consolidate these balance sheets, everything cancels out and it turns into an ordinary bank, okay? Yes, that's right. Although it's an ordinary bank that is completely capital financed, okay, because these are wholesale deposits, right? So I've abstracted from the whole retail sector, retail deposits, both business and also I've abstracted here from government, right? There's no treasury bills, there's nothing like that. You can add these things in, and I'm sure you can you see that that's possible. It's not meant to say that these are unimportant, but to say this is the core of the system that we need to understand, and this is the place where the instability comes from. So you need to be focusing here. I think it's a question whether, you know, some complexification to create new needs and to confuse people, you know, mispricing, okay, is a great source of profit, okay, for banking. Okay, if you can create something and no one's quite sure what its price should be, then you get to state what the price is. Okay, I'm trying to strip this down to make it very commodified. Okay, so that the massive profits of investment banks may go away. That this becomes a utility. Okay, that these global money dealers, maybe they're just centrally clearing counterparties. Okay, and they're and this becomes a utility that is used by other entities. So I think that the complications in terms of looking in the rear view mirror and thinking about history, I agree with you. There was a lot of complexification for the sake of complexification. Okay, we don't want that. I'm trying to say what. That was exploration, to put a positive view on it. Perhaps that was exploration of a new space, and we couldn't make it simple until we made it complex. Okay, and now if we understand it, we can say, well, what was this exploration about? What was it looking for? Maybe it was looking for this. This is what I'm throwing out for discussion. That it was trying to create this. This picture here, I put it to you, is an idealization of the shadow banking system, but it's doing essentially what the shadow banking system was doing, but much, much more simply. Okay, and in a way, you know, these dealers here, all of this was on the balance sheet of private investment banks, you know, particularly the risk dealers, right? Which was not transparent, not visible, not priced in any way that was commodified. But with central clearing counterparties, it's going to be visible. It's going to be commodified. It's going to be much more generic. And I think that's the future that I'm seeing, and I think it's evolving naturally, as a matter of fact, toward that. But if we try to align our regulation and so forth with this vision of the future, I think this is meant to be a roadmap so that you see all the different proposals people make. Where do they fit in this diagram? And therefore, how do they fit together? How do you make sure that they're not working at cross purposes? That's the goal of this roadmap here, is more to create a common language that we can talk about what kind of future we want. Thank you.
Signore qui mi sembra prima.
Thanks. Is it on? Yep. One comment and then one question. The comment is the experience that I had working in the derivatives markets.
You should introduce yourself.
I'm Rob Johnson, the director of INET. Is that there was a period in music in the United States where jazz music was developed by African Americans. And the market for entertainment was largely Caucasian, white people. And so what happened was the African Americans would create the music, and white artists would copy the music and then go book the clubs, and they would make all the money. And the response to that was created in Harlem, and it was called bebop. It which consisted of Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, playing complex music that could not be imitated. And my experience in the derivatives market is that a lot of the proliferation of products that you see is an attempt to create a complex music to protect profit margins, because once anything becomes understood or imitatable, the profit margins collapsed. And so I can hear stories about the ways of decomposition of risk and so forth, but I think a lot of the complexity is defending entry barriers, if you will. My question is, in this schema, I can see what's happening in consolidated or disaggregated, but I don't understand where you think it is good public policy to intervene and support, and where people should just experience the instabilities and gains and losses and have the market prices reflect what you might call just outcomes. Mm-hmm. How does this attach to the real economy, and what is, you talk about the Fed acting as the dealer of last resort. I'm asking why? What is that doing for society, and why should the public's balance sheet be put into play to support a system like this?
So I'll let the comment stand and just respond to the question. And I appreciate where this one is coming from too. I mean, in my own sort of intellectual heritage, I view myself as following in the tradition of British central banking, which is to say Badgett and Hawtrey and Keynes. And a very important, in fact, I think a fundamental dimension of that tradition is the observation that credit is fundamentally unstable. The inherent instability of credit is what Hawtrey referred to it as. And I think all central bankers have a sense of that, okay? That the market, or as Badgett said, the market will not, money will not manage itself, and Lombard Street has an awful lot of money to manage. This instability is both upside and downside. Okay, that in modern economics we tend to call this sort of bubbles, I guess, and collapsing of bubbles, the instability. But this is not about irrationality. This is just the way credit works, and a lot of this has to do with time, the unknowability of the future, that people are making promises to pay that they're not sure they're going to be able to pay. Because nobody knows really the future. And so mistakes get made and they build up in the system and they wash out. And so the system tends to fluctuate. It tends to be unstable. A certain amount of that is just exploration of, the system exploring what is the next new thing, and people should lose money and they should win money. And I agree with that. The problem comes when the system as a whole gets threatened by this instability. And that's when it's bad for people. If the financial system collapses, and we saw some of this morning in Andy Haldane's slides, that when you have a financial crisis and the consequence is that for 5 years you're 15% below trend GDP growth, this is a lot of cost for ordinary people. So I would definitely want to link up the cost of financial crisis with the making available of the public balance sheet. There has to be a public purpose for this. That would be my first point. The second point I would make is about, just to be clear, the discussion I'm having right here, maybe it's a bit abstract, but I'm trying to insist about liquidity intervention, okay, not about solvency intervention, so that the kind of intervention I'm imagining in a certain sense doesn't cost you any real wealth. It's not about wealth transfers. It's about moving certain bits of the system onto the balance sheet of the Fed temporarily, and at very advantageous prices. That's what I mean. That's what Badgett meant by lending at a high rate, and that's what I mean by buying at a low price. So that it shouldn't, if you do it right, it shouldn't actually cost you anything, okay, in terms of real resources. Now, in real political economy, so I'm now going to anticipate your next question, okay? This is not such an easy needle to thread. Actually, that was probably a mistake. I'm not sure how that's going to get translated. In the real world, this is not an easy game to play. That there's pressure always, okay, to buy at a high price for the government to come in and bail people out and to do wealth transfers from the taxpayers. I'm very aware of that, and I'm very opposed to that. I think that that I see liquidity support as a way of getting around the too big to fail problem. That if you had a system where you could make sure that no matter what happened, the system is not going to fail, then you could let banks fail. You could let people who made stupid decisions fail. That's what you want. That's what you want in terms of policing bad decisions and bad behavior, okay? And what you're worried about, the reason why we have too big to fail is because at the moment the big banks say, well, if you let me fail, the whole system is going to come down with me, okay? And I think I'm hoping that we can construct a system where we can call that bluff and say, you know what? No, it's not. We know how to support the system without you. Bye-bye.
Un'altra domanda qui?
There's one more question here, another one here. I think we might have both questions and then the answer to both.
Okay. Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Melling, for a very interesting lecture. I just wanted to have one comment and one question. There's a paper by Tobias Adrian and Hyung Shin about the role of broker-dealers and maybe also money dealers in the role of the economy. So to the extent that if they fail, the response of the economy to a federal funds interest shock is much larger than otherwise. So maybe this answers to some extent why there might be a social welfare reason for the central bank to intervene if the whole economy now, such as real businesses, are funding themselves via issuings of corporate bonds and so on. But my question is, what explains and what is the driver of the emergence of shadow banking? So one could say this is an exogenous determinant, such as a technological shock, that we have just IT available, we have communication technology, but what is the underlying driver that led to the rise of this? So is it the case that shadow banking arose because there's pressure to have more margins, to be more efficient, because there's lack of, I don't know, underlying productivity growth or general GDP growth, as Mr. Haldane was about to speak today, this morning? Or is it because it is genuinely an endogenous reaction to this, to something in the system? Thank you much.
Grazie. E forse l'altra domanda che era...
There is a second question up there.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask if one interpretation of your proposal could be that we are trying to make money market funding as stable as retail deposit funding, because one experience of the crisis was that retail deposit funding proved to be quite stable, whereas money market funding was quite unstable. But 100 years ago, retail deposit funding was prone to bank runs before central banks became liquidity providers. So are you suggesting to make money market funding as stable as the retail deposit funding is today, and do you think that's realistic? And then if that's the case, my second question would be, how do retail deposits get transferred into money market funding in your framework? Thank you.
So I'm taking both? Yes. So yes, Adrian and Shin, yes, this is a wonderful paper, and everyone should read this paper. So I know both of these people at Shin is at Princeton and Tobias Adrian at the New York Fed. Your question, though, is what is the driver of shadow banking? And you give me two choices, technology or complexification. And I want to take the third choice. In fact, this is the main point that I'm trying to make in this lecture, so I appreciate this question. I think financial globalization is driving shadow banking. Now, I'm not you could ask that just pushes it back to ask what is driving financial globalization, but let me not go there and just explain how financial globalization is driving this, because I think that this is the market pricing of this, okay, means that more people can be involved in this kind of a credit system who don't know one another, who aren't in the same network, they aren't in the same country. They can hedge out foreign exchange risk. They can look at a particular. It's a security, okay, that you're buying, not a loan. It's a security that you're buying, and if you don't want to hold it, you can get rid of it. Okay, you can sell it in another market. Okay, and you're funding it in liquid wholesale markets, and maybe you want to fund it in euros and swap it to dollars. Maybe you want to fund it in dollars. Maybe so. The financial globalization, I think, is the reason why we have market-based credit, and the reason why we're going to have market-based credit. I'm sure that's a controversial claim, but just think back a little bit on history, those people who know some of the history of banking, the attempts to create what's sort of most like this, syndicated loans, there's attempts to make large loans that you can then cut up into chunks and sell to different banks around the world. And, there are other attempts to create mechanisms for this sort of international financial globalization. I think those were steps on the way. Okay, and I understand this as sort of the more mature. Maybe it's not the end of the road at all. Okay, but it's the next step on the road. So that's my hypothesis, I guess. I don't know how I would prove that, but technology is necessary for this. I think that's right, and technology isn't just information technology. Some of it is also pricing technologies, some of this mathematics and things like that. I think the mathematics did run amok, and they created all kinds of interesting things because they could. But that doesn't mean that the thing had no source in real, wasn't meeting a real need. I think it was meeting a real need. It then overdid it, and credit markets do that. They're unstable, and we saw that. So that's where I would go with that. The second question. Do I want to make money market funding as stable? Well, let me approach this from an angle. Sometimes when I talk about this, I argue, and so I'll make this point now, that the globalization of funding, okay, is relatively old. Okay, the dollar funding markets, we have been through multiple crises, the Asian financial crisis, other crises. The IMF is used to dealing with this. So the top of that diagram is pretty mature. Okay, the bottom of that diagram is not very mature. Okay, this is where we had all the strange new things. Okay, with tranching and CDO squareds and so forth. So my focus is not so much on making money market funding stable. So it's not on the top of the diagram, because I think we're doing pretty well there. We know what we're doing there. I think it's the bottom of the diagram where we need some institutional innovation, and it's about making pricing of risk, okay, much more generic, much more transparent, much less profitable. To revert to Rob's idea, where I want everyone to be able to play bebop, okay, even if that maybe it's not such a good analogy for me. I don't know music. I should stop while I'm ahead here. But your final question was, where do retail deposits fit in here? It's you know, they could be a funding source as well. Similarly, government debt there's going to be markets for that. I'm trying to focus in on where the big numbers are. This is the important thing to appreciate, that the focus of economists on retail deposits, where did this come from? First of all, they used to be big numbers relative to wholesale. They're not big numbers anymore. And so now why do we focus on them? Well, we want to protect widows and orphans. You know, the widows and orphans are the ones who have accounts at the pension funds, which are doing this wholesale funding. So I think that we need to get out of this sort of knee-jerk notion that the public interest requires us to focus on retail. I think not, actually. The public interest requires us to focus where the money is, okay, which is in these wholesale markets. I don't think it's hard analytically to extend this model, but I don't do it in my talks because I want to jar people out of the way they're thinking about the world and into a new way of thinking about the world.
Maybe un'altra domanda? Sì? No?
Hi. I have a
okay.
Sure. Quick question following up on Rob on the more on the political side of your proposal. A lot of this expansion that happened from 2008 was done by the Fed. Was largely, you talk about innovation, yes, but very desperate innovation. All this stuff being invented more or less by the seat of the pants, rather than by design. And watching them push to the limits of their regulatory and legal charter to do what they did could be hair-raising at times. So in a sense, almost I'm going to ask the opposite question as well of what Robert was asking. He was asking about exposing the public to the vagaries of the market. Do we want to expose the market to the vagaries of a public institution in the sense, do we want a central bank picking winners in these markets, supporting certain markets, for instance, the mortgages above their natural, I'm going to put vaguely what should be the proper valuation of some of these assets with their liquidity floors? And to follow up on that, also on the regulatory side, there's been this ideal about the central banks being autonomous institutions. Are they going to remain autonomous institutions? Or is there going to be some political control or some political decisions being made to what they can and what they cannot do in this new environment?
These are big questions, and they're important questions. I would maybe, and I want to say something about both of them, but let me just frame a little bit. I think that when I say we're living in a Badgett moment, I'm also, you know, I'm a student of American monetary history, and that makes me acutely aware of the political economic dimensions of central banking. Here in Europe, you're used to thinking of central banks as sort of agents of the state, okay? In the US, no. We didn't have a central bank for a very long time, and one of the reasons was we were afraid that it would be an agent of the state. The other reason is that we were afraid it would be the agent of Wall Street. There are two big bogeymen in American monetary history, and they are big government and big finance. And the central bank is both. So it's kind of amazing that we got the central bank. The third big bogeyman, okay, is actually the big wide world, okay? The notion that the Fed would have some international responsibility because the dollar is the world reserve currency is another big bogeyman. The fact that the Fed lent $600 billion, okay, to foreign central banks, got Ben Bernanke in a lot of trouble, okay, in testifying at Congress. And I speak now to him as fellow professor. Ben, you missed a teaching moment. This was a moment to explain to people how the system actually works. I understand maybe you were under some pressure, but there's teaching to be done here about what would have happened if you had not done that, if you had not lent that. Now, so that's the frame that I use, where I come from in dealing with your specific questions. Do we want central banks picking winners? Definitely we don't want central banks picking winners. What I was proposing as an idealization is an outside spread that you're saying, if you're willing to sell to me at 70 cents on the dollar, I'm a buyer. And for a certain set of assets. Now, that's not, I don't see that as picking winners. But what you're observing is that that's maybe not the way it will really play out unless you're really careful, okay? That once you give the central bank the ability to buy assets, the pressure is going to be, you know, why don't you buy my asset? And you know what? Not 70 cents on a dollar, but how about $1.10? Okay? And that's sort of what it's already doing in the mortgage market. As a matter of fact, as a sort of strategy for creating a housing recovery. So it is a problem that my sort of liquidity support idea, okay, is I think essential for the backstop of the system, but it also is very vulnerable to misuse, okay. But I think this is a general aspect of central banking. You know, and I would go even maybe farther. What has the Fed done? That blowing up of the balance sheet. This is war finance. You know, this is what happens to central banks in World War I, World War II, to finance the government for essential purposes of the state, for survival of the nation. We've used those techniques to do what? Okay. To rescue our private financial system. Okay. We have done that. That is a big move with big political economic consequences. And the bill for that has not been paid yet. And I think it's very important for economists to stand up and say, that's what we did. There's a quid pro quo now. Okay. It's time to put the system back into some order. You say central banks. There's a lot of talk about central banks being autonomous. Is there danger that they will become political? This talk about central banks being autonomous is just not in the real world. You know, they aren't. They never have been. You know, they are political, and I just gave you a few examples. Okay, so it's not something to fear for the future. It's something to fear for the present. Okay, it's already here, but I think the notion that it could be otherwise is just an economist's dream. Political economy needs to be brought back into economics so that we engage with these subjects and we don't say, I'm just going to be technical here and I'm going to let somebody else worry about the political consequence of this. I think that is selling the discipline short. We need to engage with these political economic issues or we're not doing our job.
Forse l'ultima domanda. No? Maybe I will try just a small question since there is none from the audience. With your fresh and distant look to Europe, how do you see the latest let's say attempt or event in the, for example, the Euro financial crisis, like shortly in Cyprus, where you had also this discourse about, strangely enough, too big to fail for Cyprus banks and relate to the Greek crisis and so on. Do you see there is a specific European approach here, or as you said, there is a coordination of most major central banks, including the ECB, and at the end of the game, it's more or less same kind of acts from the Europeans, or is there something specific in the handling of the financial crisis on the sides of the European regulators and so on? Thank you.
Well, as I said at the beginning, when I was speaking about central bank coordination, I was mainly speaking about the C5, okay, the ECB, the Swiss National Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and the Fed. But there is another level at which you could think about that, and that is coordination within Europe of these national central banks that are sort of confederated in this European monetary union, and there's all this discussion of a banking union, whatever that might mean. Again, I view this through the lens of American history, okay, where we didn't have a central bank, but we had regional clearing banks. We had a lot of instability, and so you're getting a taste of that. We didn't have a central bank at all, so people may feel that the ECB is not strong enough to be a central bank. Well, we didn't have a central bank at all, okay? But we had regional clearing banks and major banking centers. These evolved in the system to become the regional feds that we now see. So San Francisco, Chicago, Cleveland, those regional feds. I think one possible future for Europe is that sort of evolution, okay? That the national central banks become like those regional feds in a federated system in Greater Europe. Okay, well, I would, okay, so you're saying they are, Professor Toniello says they are, okay. I will agree with that, but they are not perhaps satisfied to be such, or they're not happy being such, or this is an evolution. This is an evolution. And here is the big contrast between American history and European history, because these regional banks in the United States were not creatures of the state, right? They were bankers' banks. They were bankers' banks. And their catchment area for payments, okay, was not any particular political unit. It was a bunch of states put together. So it's a little more difficult, this transition that you are making, because there's this historical memory of being a government bank, being the agent of the state, of an independent state, which our regional feds had no memories of that at all. But so there's hysteresis. It's historically dependent, and this is some of the difficulty that leads to mispricing of assets, that leads to the kind of instability that you're seeing. But I would look through this crisis and again try to imagine what does the future, what possible future could there be, and try to embrace this future that Professor Toniello is saying is already here, but is not in our minds here, okay? These are facts on the ground as the system is evolving. I'm very sympathetic to that point of view.
Many thanks, Professor Mehrling. It was very 90 minutes, very interesting and fascinating. We hope you will be back in the next years to tell us about the next steps, since you said we are only in the early days of this evolution. In the meantime, I've seen that almost nobody had their headphones, so I think everybody could read directly your last book, and then maybe to debate with you within some forums like the Young Scholars Initiatives and so on. Grazie mille della vostra presenza, e ci sono altri eventi.
So I thank all of you for being here, and I hope you will enjoy all the other fascinating events that are scheduled until Sunday.